Before we start our last session, I just want to say thank you to all the speakers and all the participants for an absolutely wonderful symposium. It's been great. So thanks to everybody for making it so. And after this session, if I could just get all the speakers together for a couple of minutes, that would be great. This session, the collecting and exhibiting fine and private press books, 3 perspectives. I'm Lynne Farrington, Mark Samuels Lasner, Jean-Francois Vilain. I'm not going to do big introductions because you can read them in here, and you've heard a lot about all of us during the past 2 days. I wanted to start by saying that this whole symposium has been a wonderful opportunity to bring together such a great group of people and have so much fun. So I hope you've all had as much fun as I have, getting together, hearing different perspectives, and thinking about different aspects of fine and private. We're going to start this session with Jean-Francois, who's going to do a little bit, and then I will speak, and then Mark Samuels Lasner. Thanks.
Well, I'm so glad to be here. Thank Jean-Francois Vilain, Roger Wick, and Lynne Farrington for inviting me. It's been very kind. It's a wonderful evening. Anyway, and I understand there is a camera. Please, I hate these things, but that's all right. As long as the audio doesn't give me this fake French accent, I can live with it. I can really live with it. Okay, before I go any further, though I would like to take all credit for this symposium and the gorgeous catalog. Thank you for Janice Fisher, and most of all, Jerry Kelly, the great magician of printing. And the incredibly brilliant exhibitions, thanks to Andrea Gottschalk, who could not be here because she chose to be sick yesterday. I can't believe she did that to me. And Linda Brody and Emily White, her assistants. And many thanks are due William Knoll, who made sure the whole shebang happened. But I must tell you that neither exhibition nor catalog would have were it not for the Kisnak Center Energizer Bunny. Do you hear that? The indefatigable Lynne Farrington, a million and more thanks, Lynne. Well, after a long day of talks, it must be exhausted, so I'll be brief. I'll try to speak slowly, but work very well with me. So I hope that you know. And most of what you're going to hear, you heard yesterday. So I hope those of you who were there yesterday have a very short-term memory, because Lynne has mentioned lots of that in her presentation. I am tasked with presenting the private collector. Easy, right? Collectors are hoarders, but with a purpose, and are as varied as their collections. For a few examples, my wild friend Caroline Schimmel, ferociously collecting anything about women in the wilderness of early America. My fisherman friend Sid Neff and his piscatorial collection. Did I pronounce that right? My co-conspirator Phil Bishop, who was everything Thomas B. Mosher's. And my friend David McKnight, the manic and clumsy Canuck, the complete beetle maniac. And my venerable and venerated friend Mark Samuels Lasner, who monopolizes Pre-Raphaelites and late Victoriana. I could go on, but you get the idea. What I will do is tell you about how and why I arrived to the point that this college dropout, I am a college dropout. His collection ends up at this one of the oldest and most celebrated universities in America. So hang on, it's going to be a rough but short ride. For the longest time, I collected teaching jobs in France, England, and Upper Volta. That's Burkina Faso for you young'uns. And as if not more important, I collected boyfriends. I followed one to the US. I fully expected Marco Rubio to just have a call and say, go back to your closet. And but that guy did not last long. But publishing, and soon thereafter met a young medievalist, Roger Wick, and settled into the job and a wonderful relationship. 44 years. Who knew, Raj? Serendipity has a major role in the development collection. We were living in Cincinnati and discovered local and most famous of arts and crafts potteries in America, rookwood. Rookwood at that time was affordable, and we built a very nice little collection. We still have it, actually. One day, while scouring the shelves of small antique shop, remember this day of the brick shops, brick and mortars, you know, full of serendipity. I saw an unusual booklet next to a small pot. It was bound in what later I learned was inelegantly called ooze calf. I hate the word, but it does ooze. As Lynne said yesterday, it does. Your fingers, you just... The cover was blind stamped, a stylized tree. It was well printed, though, and the price was very right. I think it was maybe a couple of bucks. I bought it, and soon after collected the Roycroft books, and the pottery, metal work, and furniture of the arts and crafts. And I scoured the antique small and tiny used bookstores wherever my job took me, and that was usually my first priority. When I went to visit a university to see a professor, an author, or something like that, I went to the bookstore first, the antique bookstores, because hey, the job could wait. And one day, a serendipity strikes again. I discovered a Mosier book next to a small group of Roycrofts. Slippery slope, huh? I started collecting Mosier books. Not much later, in Tom Boss's store in Boston, I saw a misplaced Mosier on a small shelf. I glommed on it and was ready to rag Tom about carelessness. And I must have been the prince of Serendip, or the princess, I don't know. I discovered that it was published in Illinois by Hal Trevelyan and his wife, Violet. They fought the Ku Klux Klan very well. He was a fantastic man. Those two had been inspired by the elegant formats of the Mosier publications, and guess what? I started collecting Trevelyan books. Not much longer after that, we moved to New York City. I'd read that a Susan Otis Thompson was going to give a talk on the art of the book at one of the most celebrated crafts galleries in New York, Jordan Volpe Gallery. So I went. Susan spoke, and very eloquently, and about William Morris, etc., and etc., etc. So I bought her book, American Book Design and William Morris. 20 years later, I was able to pay her by writing the introduction to the second edition of her book, published by Bob Fleck at Oak Knoll. Thank you, Bob. Well, that was at the beginning of the end. I learned that there were books other than Roycroft and Mosier and Trevelyan, and that they were equally beautiful and still affordable in those days. In the late 70s, still affordable. So I decided to learn more about these presses and built a pretty decent collection of reference books about all these presses. At that time, I was what is so pithily called a bottom feeder. No, it's embarrassing. I was a youngish, in those days, publisher of textbooks, and his much youngish publisher of textbooks, and his much younger medievalist curator husband didn't make much money. My yearly salary could barely buy a copy of one of Russell's deluxe editions. And even now, I don't have the deep pocket of a Mark Diminution, though I'm one of the people. But I managed. I haunted bookstores and attended book fairs and made good friends with dealers, only too glad to feed my passion and send me their catalogs. You know, these printed catalogs, they are getting rarer and rarer, but they were so nice. You received them, you read them, it's fantastic. But that's gone. Till that time, I was focused on arts and crafts books. But Susan's book and Serendipity again led me to a wider range. So I decided a large survey of printing of private presses in America and England in the 20th century. I also attended Oak Knoll Fair. Thanks again, Bob and Rob, for leading me into ruination. And I discovered the live printers. How could I not become friends with these crazy guys? The disgusting one there? Ask me about that, and we'll tell you all about it. And I could not collect. Jesus How could I not collect as much as I could of what they produced? Indeed, I could not. And the result, a small part, visible in a gallery on this floor. So as I said, I'll be brief. I'm going to conclude thanking Will Noel, the director of the Kislak Center, and David McKnight, and again Lynne, for providing a refuge for my madness, and Roger for letting me indulging in it. And I hope that our collection of well-made books to a new generation of students as we enter the first century of this blighted electronic age. And I would encourage you, teachers, who were on the panel earlier, to take your students to see my collection, so that when I come back, I want to see fingerprints on all these books. Thank you.
I'm going to speak a little bit on the institutional side of collecting and exhibiting fine press books, but also books more generally, other collections. I think one of the interesting things for me institutionally, and I'm sure other people like Mark can attest to this, is that we are indebted to collectors. We are indebted to collectors for doing what we can't do. We can't buy the huge quantities, or we can't necessarily buy everything that's out there. And collectors are so important to institutions because collections become the basis of larger collections over time, and they help to bring collections and provide a focus to what's going on in an institution. And that's very much true about what's happened with the Vilain Wick collection, but other collections as well that have come in over the years. I remain indebted to somebody by the name of Charles Waltz Burr, a doctor in Philadelphia, who in an earlier generation collected a range of wonderful early books that remain important. His name is kind of fallen aside. I know Dan Traster is very much aware of the impact of that collection on the university, but it's those kinds of collections, sometimes collections with names, sometimes without, but important collections in institutions that help to build an area. Steve Rothman, who's here today, his comic book collection has been very important and now people are studying those books more and more. We have lots of classes at the university involved with that kind of thing, but I can't collect all those individual comic books or graphic novels, and it's wonderful to have had somebody to put together a major collection, and then those collections attract other collections as people become aware that you have things, that people are using them at the institution. It's happened prints more recently. So collectors are our friends. We love collectors because they have time, they have a focus, they sometimes, but not always, have the finances. I mean, as Jean-Francois said, you know, you can bottom feed and come up with wonderful collections over time. Or you can, you're young and then you decide, well, that's not, you know, that's a group of materials. I had somebody come in with 3 boxes of underground comics recently, things from the late 60s and early 70s, which are really hard to find, but you know, he bought them when he was young, sort of packed them away. He ready for him to get rid of them, and so he came to me and said, would you be interested in having that kind of thing? So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that collectors are so important in so many different ways. And, you know, a lot of us, you know, we can buy some things, we can acquire some things, and, you know, as people here know, I have tried to acquire things, but often what I'm able to acquire, whether it's artist books, fine press books, any of these kinds of things, are more representative examples of what's going on in the field rather than comprehensive collections of things. So my hand's off to collectors who feel that it's important to give collections, you know, or to help institutions acquire collections in all kinds of different ways. So I wanted to say something about that and about why, you know, what we can do institutionally in collecting, but what, you know, how we are indebted to others for helping us to build collections in 12 ways, as Dan Traster would say. I also wanted to talk a little bit about exhibiting collections, exhibiting fine press books, or exhibiting other kinds of things as well, because I think that's a really important thing. Different kinds of exhibitions and different kinds of ways of using the collections which have an exhibition component. I mean, exhibitions are important because they create an awareness of new collections and institutions, so people aren't always aware of what's been acquired by an institution, and when we do exhibitions, it brings people in. We can articulate this, a vision of that collection and present it to the public, and that's a really important thing to do. It's also a way of interpreting and telling stories about collections and letting people know, you know, there's a story here. We're telling a story about color in this particular exhibition, but there are other kinds of stories that can also be told with collections. So collections are important in a lot of different ways, and sometimes collections intersect in interesting ways. I did 2 exhibitions last year that had to do with children's books in different ways. One was a collection that we had received from Widow, which was a lot of his original artwork, but also copies of his books and a lot of other kinds of things like that. And I did that exhibition in conjunction with an exhibition of a woman who her name was Atha Tihan, and she was a designer of children's books for 40 years. And as part of that, she did a lot of independent work. And some of that independent work was designing William Steig's children's books. And that intersection was a really interesting intersection. And to be able to bring out those kinds of stories and to use collections, those intersections is a really interesting thing to be able to do. So I think that's another piece of what exhibitions can do. I mean, exhibitions can also allow you to rethink collections that have been here, to approach them, as I said, in new and different ways. And that's something we do try to do. You know, we try to rethink how collections can be used and what are those stories we're telling. We told one story, but maybe it's a different story at this time that we can tell with that collection. There's also, you know, an aesthetic component. We're presenting materials, we're presenting objects, material objects, and we want people to learn how to appreciate them as objects. Sometimes the text is important, but sometimes they also, especially with things like fine press books, artist books, learning how to appreciate the object as an object. Now that said, exhibitions, as Russell, you know, alluded to, are a problem for books. We know they're a problem for books. You know, it's the same thing with books on the shelf. If they're all closed, people aren't experiencing them. And if they're open to one opening, they're not experiencing them either fully. So the idea of, you know, showing an opening from a book, which unfortunately is what you put books in cases or you put images on the walls, that's always going to be an issue. And one of the things we do try to do here is do a lot of exhibitions like what I did today in Lee, which was pull out a handful of books which were in the collection which related to Mark's talk last night, and invited people in to look at those things, to interact with them in a day. I think that's a really important thing, and we try, when we do symposium, you know, various kind of symposia, conferences, or things like that, we try to include that element, which is a more hands-on element. I mean, we have a gallery, and it's a wonderful gallery, and I love how the exhibit looks, because no other time will we see all those in that way as a kind of totality. And there's something exciting about that, and something really useful in being able to see that range, you know, in a space. But it's also nice to be able to go into a space where you can actually sit and look at a book and turn the pages and think about what you're seeing. You know, Russell's book, you know, his Euclid is wonderful. And it's too bad to have to open it to one page and only show one piece of it. You want it to be able to, you know, pull it down from the shelf and invite people to sit and look at it. And that's the kind of thing that, you know, once the exhibit's down, we'll be able to do that when we bring students in to look at things, or when we have other groups who are interested in this kind of material. So that's another piece of it. And the other thing that I love doing is having groups of students come in and literally sit down with books. And I mean, not just stand there and look at something we've opened, but with the more contemporary artist books, with other things like that. We'll often do something called musical chairs. The books are here, and you look at the book that's in that space, and then you get up and exchange your chair with somebody else, and you go look at something else. And that whole experience, more times I see students sitting down and actually reading the books. Doesn't happen often enough, and I love to see that interaction where they're actually reading the book, thinking about the book, all of those kinds of things. So I think exhibitions are different kinds of things. We can have temporary exhibitions, we can have groups of things we put out to share, and those fit into that understanding of what it is to exhibit a book. I mean, that whole notion of show and tell is great, but to actually sit people down and let them go through something and really get a sense of what the work is quite exciting. I think that's all I've got to say right now, but I just wanted to give you some of how I approach those kinds of things and how I think about those kinds of things. Thank you.
I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And I wonder who had the brilliant idea of scheduling a symposium that begins with one mark and ends with another. I am, of course, a collector. I'm not a hoarder. I make that point very clear. And what is interesting is that Jean-Francois and I, in a sense, at the same point. I started a little earlier. I realized it was 49 years and 3 months ago that I bought my first example of fine printing. I was in London, and I was with my grandmother, and I dragged her to Bernard Quaritch, and she bought for me for £40, I remember this as if it were yesterday, a copy of the Kelmscott Press Gothic Architecture. Now, I no longer have this book. I regret disposing of it, except I have no idea how it ended up in the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. They don't know either. But I came to that book because, forgive me, of William Morris. When I grew up in Connecticut, we had an elderly family friend named Mrs. Hayes, who was born in London in 1880. And she had known, because she was the daughter of a writer and scholar named Joseph Jacobs, she had known William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones. She was seen as an infant by George Eliot, which I think is technically possible, but a family myth. But I heard about these people. And I was, from an early age, pretty obsessed by them. And I can tell you something that, speaking of one of the themes of Mrs. Hayes told me that William Morris's favorite color was green. So I was already on my way as a teenager. And over the last 50 years, I have collected, in a sense, where Jean-Francois started in the arts and crafts movement. He's gone way beyond me to the 20th and 21st centuries. I'm still stuck in the 1890s. But I have also collected many things other than press books. The period that I like, from 1850 to 1900, I try to cover in depth. If it's British, if it's an aspect of the culture of that time, it's of interest to me. Fine printing, private press books, illustrated books, all fit in to my world. But in an effort to stop myself from simply trying to get all the Kelmscott books, all the Doves books, all the Ashendeans, all those other things, and of course, many years ago, I was collecting Roycroft and Mosher with the best of them. I decided, because I was very attracted to this, to specialize in association books, books that belong to someone of interest, presentation copies. There had to be something special about the particular copy. And boy, does this slow you down. So I have tried to get books such as John Addington Symon's Daniel Press, Garland of Rachel, a copy of the Dove's first book, Tacitus, inscribed by Emery Walker to May Morris, books by all of the major publishers, printers, book designers of the late 19th century. And just recently, I have bankrupted myself by acquiring a copy of the Kelmscott Chaucer. It is, I have to boast about this, it is one of the 14 copies signed by William Morris, and I'll be paying for it for the rest of my life. I find that books are fascinating objects. They have an extraordinary aesthetic, tactile appeal. They are portable works of desire, in a sense. Kinds of books. Books I would never think of collecting. Books I know nothing about. I love books. And I think almost everyone in this room who is a collector, a maker, a curator, whatever you are, you all love books. It's almost impossible to explain why, but we know it. In my case, I have extended my love of books to occasionally design a few things. I have also acquired books by many later printers and designers, very well into Jean-Franc and Roger's collection, because those artists and designers created editions of the writers of my period. So while my collection stops at about 1905, it does include work by, among others, Rogers, the Grabhorn Press, Will Bradley, Francis Mennel, and my friends Ray Nichols and Jill Cipher, who are here from my local letterpress operation in Newark, Delaware, Laid Graffiti. So I actually acquire a few contemporary books. Books have been such an important part of my life that I'm now trying to figure out what to do with them. For the last decade and a little more, my collection has been at the University of Delaware Library. And it may stay there, or it may not. We're not sure yet. But I can tell you one thing. Books are going to be with me till I'm dead, and probably after that as well. I'd like to conclude by saying a couple of things about exhibitions. And I have been involved in a lot of them as a lender, as an organizer, a facilitator, a reviewer. I could almost say I'm an exhibitionist. Exhibitions, for those of you who have not done them, are like letterpress printing. It has to be done slowly, and it takes a lot of time and effort. They do not happen overnight. We should thank Lynne and Jean-Francois for producing this fabulous show. And I'd also like to say things. One is that I often think that there's an analogy between what you call fine books, press books, the book beautiful, the ideal book, compared to the ordinary book, whether that is a paperback or an e-book. And the difference, I think, has an analogy to that of dress. Fashion versus the schmada. Style versus a t-shirt. And I often think when I look at a wonderful book where the form and content go so well together, as there are so many books like that in the exhibition, of Max Beerbohm's description of Beau Brummel, whom he described as having a combination of dark cloth and perfection in linen. Think of the parallel. Type in whatever color on the page. Finally, I think we also have to contemplate the fine printing book and the artist's book for what they are. and I think sometimes we overlook this. They are remarkable, wonderful products of the human brain, hand, and heart. And I leave you with that.
I think we have time for a few questions, if there are any.
Why is the Robin Hood by Grabhorn your favorite? Repeat that? What? Why is the Robin Hood by the Grabhorn Press your favorite, according to the exhibition?
The bastard, he would ask. For many reasons. First, for many reasons. First, I like the Grabhorn. I like the way they approach printing. I like their commitment to producing a beautiful book. In this way, they wanted to create something that was really kind of as medieval as they can get without being just a copy. It was an exercise in, an homage to, and more importantly, and the design is fantastic. But more importantly, I love the illustrations. The illustrations are by a guy named Valentino, who immigrated to the States when he was a very young man, and he was one of the wonderful illustrators. And from the 20s to the 70s or 80s, he also was a writer who had his own press, the Golden something press. My memory is gone. And he produced images that really fit the text, and he worked in close collaboration with the printers. And he also, in his own press, the Golden House, in his own press, he just kind of integrated text and in illustration as well. His illustrations are and sophisticated. He was also, by the way, a delightful children's book writer. He published about 15 children's books that are worth reading because of their extraordinarily lovely naivety. But not naivety as a bit kind of, it was nice, unassuming, sweet nature, sweet. He was a sweet person. It was in his nature to be sweet, and he was, for instance, a good friend of John de Paul, who also just shared many of these characteristics. So does that answer your question? That's not the Golden Eye. Golden Cross, bless you. Yes. I'm so glad he's here. That's it. The librarian of the people.
It's really a simple question. Mark, remind me to give you my business card before we leave.
I already have your business card, Mark.
Mark, would you be willing to talk a little bit about the issues you've been confronting with gifting a collection? I know we have printers here who
You're
have
putting me
their
on the hot
archives.
spot, Caroline. I mean,
No, we have printers here who have their
my
archives.
lawyers
They
are
might
gonna
want to shh.
I can't say
You
anything.
cannot stop her.
I can't say legal advice.
Okay, enough said.
Yeah. Okay. But the collection is still at the University of Delaware. So, it's available to people, and, we're very friendly to visitors.
And you should visit it. It's absolutely amazing. At the director would say it's amazing, amazing.
Since you're both collectors, can you share with us your best find story?
Oh, God. Yes. A year and a half ago, I spent 8 hours in a U-Haul storage facility outside of Vancouver, British Columbia, plowing through in 95-degree heat, illuminated by a 10-watt bulb, the collection of a British Columbia professor named William Dick Frediman. And I found in this collection one of those, plastic photo albums that was filled with ephemera and letters and bits and pieces of the Pre-Raphaelites, which was his. And I bought this album. I had no idea precisely what was in it. I bought several photographs, which 2 of them turned out to be by Lewis Carroll, and a number of other things. And I got back to my hotel room, and I start going through this photograph album. And there's a little letter of this, there's a William Morris pamphlet, and then there's, in this album, a plastic bag with a shock of red hair attached to a label that says, in the handwriting of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, from Lizzie, February 1862. And for those who may not be familiar, this is the story of when Rossetti's wife and muse died. He buried his manuscript poems in her coffin and dug them up again 7 years later so he could publish them. But she was his famous model, and her most famous feature was her beautiful red hair. And I remember sitting in this hotel room and thinking, I'm in a hotel room in Vancouver, some of the most famous hair in the history of art.
Well, mine is very prosaic. Actually, I found at the Free Library, they have and I always check their, ever since I've been checking their shelves every time I go there. There was a very thin little book, a Mosier book. No, it was not. It was a Copeland and Day. Oh no, sorry, it was a Bradley, because that. Anyway, it was a little Bradley, the little bottle, the leather bottle. It was on sale there for the exorbitant price of $1, and that was actually the greatest bargain. There were more. That's it. Nothing like this. Oh.
Yeah, but you weren't suffering in 95-degree heat for 8 hours.
That is true. That is true.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we should probably stop here because we're asking Jean-Francois to reveal his secrets, and there's just no telling where that'll end. And so I'm going to conclude not by thanking Jean-Francois tonight, because I'll be doing that for the rest of my life, but by thanking Lynne Farrington, who had just the sheer guts and tenacity and chutzpah that it takes to deal with Jean-Francois. And the organizational skills and all the Energizer Bunny batteries and everything it takes to organize a symposium like this and an exhibition like this. So please join me in thanking Lynne Farrington.